Hey everyone, welcome to session 224 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. I'm joined by many-time guest, Dr. Andy Bondy. He returns to the show for a fun chat, and our conversation is centered around a recent talk he gave, which was titled Verbal Behavior, Myths and Misconceptions. What myths and misconceptions are we talking about here? Well, of course, I don't want to spoil it in this introduction, but we did manage to cover a wide variety of topics. Some of these included what's new with everything PECS, including their certified classroom process. We talked about the conceptual rather than database nature of the verbal behavior book itself. We talked about recall versus recognition, aided versus unaided communication systems, selection versus topography-based communication systems, the more subtle aspects of the autoclitic, whether PECS limits improvised communication, the topic of matching to sample versus tacting in PECS, the nature of prompts, and constructional aspects to learning. And honestly, there's a lot more I could say as well, but that's just a limited list of the things we covered. We covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time, so I'm going to try to make these introductory comments brief. As many of my chats with Andy have gone, again, this podcast could have been twice the length of what it is. But the good news is that I've already got Andy scheduled for a follow-up interview later on in the summer. So if you have questions based on this podcast, perhaps we can feature an Ask Andy Anything segment. So keep an eye on your Behavioral Observations emails for future announcements. That is, of course, if you're on the email list. If you're not on the email list, go to behavioralobservations.com and get on that email list so you can get the show notes for every episode delivered straight to your inbox. And the show notes for this episode will be particularly useful because Andy grounds everything he talks about in the published research literature, and we've got all the references there in the show notes over at behavioralobservations.com waiting for you. This podcast was brought to you by the University of Cincinnati Online. They've designed a Master's of Education in Behavior Analysis program that is 100% online and asynchronous, meaning you log in when it works for you. If you want to learn more, go to online.uc.edu and click the Request Info button. We're also brought to you by Behavior University. Their mission is to provide university-quality professional development for the busy behavior analysts. Learn about their CEU offerings, 8-hour supervision course, as well as their RBT course, and podcast-specific discounts over at behavioruniversity.com/observations. And I want to give a shout-out to all of you who have been going to Behavior University and using the promo code observations over there. It's really great when folks visit the sponsors. Behavior University has been supporting the show for a long, long time. And so I really appreciate listeners going to check out their stuff. I think that's it for opening remarks. Again, really action-packed show here, so let's get right to it. Without any further delay, let's hear from Dr. Andy Bondy.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Andy Bondy, welcome back to Behavioral Observations. It's good to see you again.
Nice to see you too. Fun to be back.
Indeed. I think it was session 137 that you were last on, and then I think you were on very early on in the podcast as well. People always enjoy what you have to say, and so again, it's glad to have you. I'm very glad to have you back. So the last time we checked in with you was in late 2020. And of course, the world was, kind of beset by all problems associated with the pandemic and so forth. So I guess what I'd like to do is just, we've got a whole host of interesting questions about, nerdy verbal behavior stuff.
Sure.
I'm looking forward to getting into that, but just take a few minutes here, if you don't mind, and just kind of catch us up on what both you and the PECS team have been up to, how you guys managed to kind of navigate the various and sundry, restrictions in terms of work coming out of the pandemic. And it seems like we're on the other side of things now, or as on the other side of things as we're likely to get. And, kind of brings up to speed to what you guys are doing these days.
Well, as the pandemic spread, obviously started impacting on all of our entities, We have offices in 16 countries around the world. So everybody was having to deal with it and cope and what do we do and all the workshops and direct consulting and trying to get classrooms going. Luckily, technology had created Zoom, and we were using it, if you will, a little bit, and then we realized we had to use it a lot of bit. And to me, it's kind of like in evolution, when the environment is steady state, you don't get a lot of dramatic evolutionary changes. When the environment stresses organisms, that's when you get, oh, look, some of these mutations actually work in this new environment. That's kind of what happened in terms of business. You got pressure, you got stressed, you had to do new things. And lo and behold, some of those things are actually better. Everybody was worried about the quality of the workshop. So, we could do the Zoom, we could test the impact, we probed what people wanted. Were they learning what they were learning when we had them in a room? We realized it was a pretty good product. Plus, it gave us more opportunity to split the workshop, do it at different times, do it over weekends, do it over 4 days, then 2 days. And by, coming up with more creative solutions, we actually reached more people because, before it's like, could you go to a hotel on Monday and Tuesday, and we probably didn't realize how we were cutting some opportunities out. So now, if you will, we're on the other side. We go to all the hotels in the world we want to, but we don't do that very much now. I think people are still a little uncomfortable and learned that Zoom formats are good. A lot of programs, school districts, they want the direct training, so we will do that. But obviously, consultation is back to being live and real, and that has helped. But we'll never go back to completely pre-pandemic arrangements because we reach a lot more people by having this bigger diversity. We develop more talks, more short talks. You would never go to a hotel and book a hotel and do an hour or two. You would just never do it.
Yeah, the scale doesn't work.
Right? But put it on, and you got a group of people who want that topic in depth. So it's curious, but actually, made us do more interesting things, and people have responded well to it. So
very cool. That that reminds me. It's kind of I caught up with Greg Hanley a few weeks ago on the podcast, and he had a very similar response as it relates because he had just launched their consulting group FTF, and then right on the heels of that, the world shut down, and so I think many people in the field had to be equally nimble. It's interesting how these changes kind of drive innovation. It kind of somewhat reminds me of what was that book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions? It's kind of like what do you refer to as I think that's where the paradigm shift term was coined.
Yeah, but that also requires the old people to die off. Don't forget that part,
Matt. Okay. Well, we'll hold off on that as long as we can. So.
The other interesting change is that we've always tried to promote what we call, we're known for doing PECS and PECS training, but we actually do, if you will, a lot more. We try to get classrooms going. So we have this PECS Certified Classroom process that's very intense over an entire year, and it works with the entire team. And over the last 3 or 4 years, interest in that in this country and around the world has increased dramatically too. So people are buying into, don't just give me an hour or two or a day of training. They're starting to realize training consultation over a period of time, a year, is what actually gets you the changes that are then sustainable. And so that's been really good, that people are willing to invest more time and effort into getting their staff trained so that they can sustain those changes for the students they're working with.
That's really good to hear that people are interested in long-term partnerships like that, and that there's a market for that sort of thing. Yep. One of the things I've seen over the years as a school-based consultant is people going to a workshop, getting training, and that person becomes essentially the cheerleader, the evangelist, the chief cook and bottle washer for that particular intervention. I see this a lot with like multi-tiered systems of supports, PBIS, things along those lines. And then invariably what happens, that person gets promoted, they move, they go to another school district, they retire or whatever, and then the practice goes away because you don't have that key point. It's a single point of failure, as one person might say. And so the fact that there are whether they're school districts or other entities that are interested in this kind of long-term capacity building process is very good to hear. So I'm happy to hear that you guys are getting that type of work.
And we've encouraged that. We've always said, give us your team. We want the teacher, all your paraprofessionals, the speech pathologists, OTs, PTs, psychologists. We want the team to go through training. We're not going to train the teacher and then assume that the teacher knows how to train everybody else. That is a terrible model. And more districts are realizing, that's what we have to do. We've got to get everybody in the team to go through this process, speak a common language, and then move forward. In Delaware, just by the way, teachers who go through this year-long process, because we collect a ton of information on their performance, when they go through the process and we say, they've got all these skills and we can document all the skills they have, they get their certificate of teaching autism/severely handicapped without having to pile on university courses because they've demonstrated the actual skills.
Oh, that's really cool. That's it's probably something easy to get through a small state like Delaware to make those type of structural changes in the educational bureaucracy. So it's good to see that you guys were able to make that happen. So, and I know you guys have we talked about this, I think, in our first episode. You guys have a long, you guys go way back with the state of Delaware and the Delaware Autism Program and so on and so forth.
Showed up there in 1983.
That's pretty cool. I will put a link to the show notes for that episode and your other one as well. So if people want to go back and get the history of PECS, it's a really fun story. And so I'll go to behavioralobservations.com. I'll have the link to that episode waiting for listeners right there. And I encourage people to check it out if they missed it on the first go around. So, that's really neat. Hey everyone, I know it's a little early for the first commercial break, but this one's particularly on brand because I'm looking at behavioruniversity.com right now, and under their available CEU pages are not one, but two CEU events with none other than Andy Bondy. That's right. There is one on AAC strategies for learners with autism and another one on error correction. Error correction is something I did want to get into in the show. We just didn't have time to do it. I think it's something he's talked about previously on behavioral observations. But if you go to behavioruniversity.com, you can sign up for his 2-hour CEU on error correction. And maybe that's something we can get into when we have him back on the episode. But for the time being, go to behavioruniversity.com. And don't forget to go to behavioruniversity.com/observations to get your listener discount. All right, let's get back to this interview. All right, Andy. So you had reached out to me and you said, "Hey, I've been catching up on some episodes, and I think it was you'd heard something on one of the episodes. I think it was the panel discussion from last year's Verbal Behavior Conference, and you had some not just some thoughts on that, but also you had some. You had recently done a talk." Called Verbal Behavior Myths and Misconceptions. And you rightly pointed out that this would be an interesting topic for discussion here on the show. So thanks so much for reaching out to make this happen.
Sure.
So based on that, again, the title, Verbal Behavior Myths and Misconceptions, that's going to draw probably most people in who are interested in this stuff. So one of the things I like to ask people a lot about on this show is their motivation. So what motivated you to put this talk together? Was there something you were seeing in practice? Was there something you're seeing in the literature or not seeing? So we'll get into what it is you want to say in the first place, but I'm curious about the why first. So if we could discuss that and then we'll get into the content itself. But I want to hear about what made you want to sit down and crank out this slide deck and, do the talk and all that stuff.
The why has been around, if you will, for a while. And I've written about it elsewhere, in terms of this understandings about PECS and things like that. But when I was in graduate school is when I encountered Skinner's verbal behavior, trying to figure out how to teach kids to ask questions. And my professor would turn around, grab Skinner's book off the shelf and said, "Here, read this." I'm like, tricky way to answer how do you teach kids to ask questions, because there's no how-to section in the book, but you kind of figure out someplace in the book there is something. And so it influenced everything I did from graduate school on, the way to analyze language and think about language, the units of language, the verbal operants and all that fun stuff. So as Lori and I and other people were putting together PECS, everything I knew about verbal behavior infused every single thing I did within PECS. And we started writing about that from the beginning. The very first descriptions of PECS talked about bands, tax interverbals, autoclitics, all the fun stuff from the very first paper on. Had a talk in 1988 at a AMA convention, essentially, language teaching. How long have we been wrong? So I realized you could use pictures to get verbal behavior going, and everybody still just wanted to focus on speech. So then years later, when I started to hear people saying, "Well, you can't do PECS and verbal behavior," my mind just exploded. It's like what? Every change in phase structure is organized by an analysis of verbal behavior. So what does that possibly mean? And then I started to learn more and more about what some people who were saying they were talking about verbal behavior were saying about PECS and other things. And that's kind of the root of my trying to get a balanced perspective on the world. Why do some people think PECS is not within the verbal behavior, broadly speaking, or against some of the principles within the book? And that's what I've been trying to pay attention to over time. The tricky part, if you will, is that, as I said, there is no how-to section in Skinner's book. There's not a single chapter that says how to teach a kid with autism, how to develop language, how to teach a man. There's nothing in the book on that. So that anyone who comes along and says, "Well, I have a verbal behavior program, and this is how to teach verbal behavior," you may be talking about the verbal operants, but you're not talking about what Skinner wrote, because he didn't write about how to do the teaching part. There's no data in the book. There are no experiments in the book. It's real analysis. He's kind of saying everything that I ever learned, pretty much working with pigeons. Let me see if those learning principles can apply to this more complex thing that the rest of us call language. And it's kind of up to the reader to say, yeah, it fits. But Skinner isn't proving it in the book.
And it's mind blowing that was written in 1957. I keep every time that the discussion of that book comes up, and it's like, this was written in 1957. It
was published in 1957.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
He wrote parts of it over almost a 10-year period teaching at Harvard to graduate students. So it was put together over a period of time. But yeah, I mean, you think about schedules of reinforcement in a book that has hundreds and hundreds of, studies. And then you have another book where there's not a single study in it. It's a very different kind of book.
Yeah. Just kind of light years ahead of its time for sure. So, all right. So let's get into the talk itself, the myths and misconceptions. And maybe along the way, you mentioned, some people saying that, the use of PECS and other types of perhaps what we might, I don't know if this would fit into the same category, but selection-based type of communication strategies isn't verbal behavior. What is the, I know you have a very different point of view, obviously, but what is the case to be made for that? If you were to try to understand the perspective of someone who is making that claim. Could you make at least some attempt to kind of, if not agree, at least try to reason your way to their point of view, or otherwise steelman that argument to some extent?
Part of my approach has been, let's go back to, basic issues related to logic. And I mean the logic we learned when we were in grade school. I don't mean advanced philosophy. I mean the simple stuff. Okay. So, I did this with my grandkids when they were 3 and 4 years old. Some things are opposite, right? Up, down, in, out. Those are opposite. What about red and blue? They're not opposite. They're different. So you can have a whole category of things that are different, but they're not opposite. Okay. Then you have another category of some things are better. Getting an A on a test is better than getting a B. So that's not opposite, and it's a little more than different because there's actually a value attached to them. So think about other topics before we get back into, the behavioral one. Think about when you were in intro psychology. I'll bet you had some discussion about memory. Do you remember discussions about recall memory versus recognition memory? Okay.
That was. I remember I remember ordering effects, recency and primacy and things like that. But
I'll bet you if you actually go look at your notes, you'll have seen this one. Multiple choice test is recognition memory because the answer is in front of you. Go for it. Recall memory is an essay. You pulled it out of your head. Okay.
Or somewhere.
Yes, somewhere. Hopefully not the page next to you, but somewhere. So recall versus recognition. People in psychology have talked about that for a long, long, long time. But if I went to you and said, okay, Matt, which one is better? Recall or recognition memory? Which one's better? You look at me and go, they're different. There are some things that I could do to help recall memory. There are different things that I could do to help recognition memory. But you would not have an argument about which one is better. Speech pathologists for a long time have talked about aided versus unaided communication systems. That's their terminology. So speech is unaided. Sign language is unaided. Picture-based systems are aided. Print systems are aided. But again, if you went to a speech pathologist and said, which one's better, they would just stare at you and go, they're different. So in our field, Jack Michael talked about selection-based versus topography-based. Well, which one is it? Is one better than the other, or are they different? I submit that there's absolutely no distinction between those two ways of talking about things versus recall versus recognition or aided and unaided. They're talking about the same set of issues with different language, different terminology. And we're behavior analysts, so we believe our analysis is the best. Great. But it still comes down to those are two different things. And we're running around having arguments about which one is better. That there's some theoretical reason that selection-based is better than topography-based. And it makes no sense to do that. It's not about research. It's about logic. When people try to present research to back up, one of the articles people talk about is there was a review by Bill Potter and Brown taking a look at what was in the research at the time. It's like, I don't know, 20 years old, maybe more. And they kind of concluded that but topography-based was better. Then I always tell people, do the little thing whenever you read a review paper, go read the papers reviewed. Take a little time, get into the paper. Don't just buy the conclusion. Read what's actually going on. So if you read the 10 studies that are reviewed in that publication, 7 deal with college students. College students.
Oh, wow.
And I'm going to read a review about college students. and use that to inform what I'm doing with this 2-year-old that's walking into my clinic classroom who has no verbal behavior whatsoever. I don't think that's very informative. And if you look at the other ones, there was no comparison between, if you will, picture-based and sign-based, mands versus text. Not all the studies were banned. Only one study actually, had a man condition. Everything else was on the receptive side. One of the studies compared Greek and Arabic symbols versus simple hand motions, like making a fist. I'm sorry, I put some symbols like a circle and line versus 3 fingers crossed over your left eyebrow while you're thinking. How could you possibly do a study comparing those and concluding one is better than the other because it's selection based?
Yeah, it may have had high internal and perhaps limited external validity.
Yes. So it's like when you actually read through the studies, you kind of go, like, what? How is this actually informing things? So it's not helping. Another study that a lot of people talk about is a study about a good friend, Matt Tincani. Matt and I published together. We worked together. We do a lot of things together. But he had a publication pretty early on in his career, if you will, with 2 kids with ASD. It was trying to teach PECS to both and sign to both. And one of the kids vocalized more in sign. So you've got a group of people saying, see, sign language yields more vocalization. In 1 out of 2 kids, number one, plus he only went through phase 3 in PECS. Not even sentence structure, didn't get to attributes, didn't get to commenting, simply stopped that in discrimination training. But more to the point, when you read in the paper, Matt introduced a delayed prompt in the sign condition, not in the PECS condition. That delayed prompt is one that we introduce in phase 4 in PECS, not in phase 3. We introduce it in phase 4. So he's varying sign versus PECS, but he's varying the teaching strategies. So how can we attribute any difference to just the topography versus selection based?
I see. And just for folks, so that's the Tincani 2004 comparing the picture exchange communication system and sign language. All right. I got that reference for the notes also. This will be, again, not to belabor the point, people, but this will be an episode where the notes are going to be very helpful.
Sorry. Just by the way, Matt, and I'm blocking on the publication, that a couple of years later did a publication showing that, when you introduce delayed prompting in phase 4, you get vocalization for kids using PECS.
Yeah, I think there's a follow-up in 2006, if I'm reading your
2006.
And I'm just ripping this off your PowerPoint here, folks. I don't have this command of the verbal behavior literature. So
that's why I have it in the PowerPoint, because even I don't remember all this stuff. I'm a kind of visual learner. Ha.
Hey everyone, I'm going to take another quick break here and let you know that balancing work and life can be difficult, and that's why the University of Cincinnati Online designed a Master's of Education in Behavior Analysis program that is 100% online and asynchronous, meaning you log on when it works for you. Their student success coordinators will work with you from start all the way until graduation to ensure you are receiving the support you need. Graduate in as few as 5 semesters from a top 10 program in total number of graduates and prepare for the BCBA exam. The program is FAFSA eligible, and the University of Cincinnati Online also offers a business partnership program to offer tuition discounts to eligible employees. If you want to learn more, go to online.uc.edu and click the Request Info button. Can you just real quick, and maybe I'm the only one who's a little fuzzy on this, but as most listeners know, I I don't work with folks with these types of communication needs all that frequently. So just remind me, I know phase 3 is when you get to selecting across different items on the
Yes.
of pictures and things like that. Is 4 where you start introducing the sentence strip? Is that
Yes, I've been a bit telegraphic. Sorry about that. Yes, we start off just trying to teach the kids you can influence somebody else in phase 1 by giving them a picture. Then we work on some generalization issues in terms of get it to other people in our environments and other reinforcers. Then we work on discrimination. Starts with like high preferred and non-preferred differences, and eventually getting to equally preferred with a correspondence check thrown in to make sure. Then to the sentence structure. And when we introduce sentence structure, we're keeping the same function. Because what we need to do when a kid uses a picture, early on it's pretty clear it's a demand, it's a request for something. But later on, we hope to teach tax, comments. And it's going to be the same picture. So the issue becomes, how do we shift a kid from using a picture to demand to hopefully using a picture to tact or as a part of an introverbal or anything else? And so that's what phase 4 is trying to do, is trying to transition to that goal. And this is another thing which we talked about from the beginning, which I think there's also been a lot of misunderstanding about what is the role of the I want icon in phase 4. Okay, recently, a prominent analyst, well known for teaching about verbal behavior, has written kids and PECS are prompted to add autoclitic-like words not under appropriate control. Okay? Essentially saying that I want is not really an autoclitic. And part of the justification is that kids don't add things like those autoclitics or attributes as well until they're about 4 years old, having hundreds and hundreds of words in the repertoire. But the issue is, are autoclitics limited to describing grammar, syntax? I mean, they're helpful in understanding and analyzing grammar and syntax and functions like that. But Skinner talked about other types of autoclitics. He talked about what the rest of us would call body language, and this wonderful thing called intonation. So when you have a typically developing child, and the child can say truck, but that's it. He does not yet have sentence structure. So he cannot say, I want the truck versus I see the truck. And yet, kids at a single word stage, if you will, command and tact clearly to the audience. And they do it by intonation. The way they say the single word clearly gets the listener to understand he wants the truck versus he's looking at the truck rolling down the street. That's just interesting. Let's talk about a truck. So intonation is an autoclitic acquired by typical kids as they're acquiring the verbal operas. It's not a separate lesson. It is co-development. Now, kids using a picture system, essentially, they need the equivalent. They need the equivalent autoclitic frame, if you will, structure of an autoclitic to indicate to the listener, I'm using this word picture as a tact versus command. Typical kids are doing it from the beginning. They're not waiting until they have sentence structure of 400 words, 600 words later before they're using autoclitics. They're using it from the beginning. So our kids need to learn it really quickly. They cannot wait for 400 pictures to come in before we say, oh, by the way, now we're going to teach you autoclitics. So it's a real unfortunate interpretation of what the autoclitic is and Skinner's rich description of autoclitic functions, limiting it to analysis of grammar. Just by the way, the criticism about using attributes. Once we teach kids structure like I want ball, we pretty quickly realized, well, not every ball is the same to the kid. I want the big ball, little ball, I want the red ball, I want the soft ball, whatever it is. We can start teaching attributes to specify the reinforcers. So we teach attributes, if you will, it's a tact function within the bigger man function, right? Because it's under the control of the properties of the reinforcer. But broadly, the frame still is man. I want the truck. I want the big truck. I want big truck is still a man, but big is functioning as an equivalent of a tact within that broader function. So that's how we introduce attributes within the man function. Later on, we'll try to transition it to, I see the big truck, I see I hear the loud bell, things like that. The issue is, again, if you look at typical language development, it's true that those attributes are within sentence structure when kids have hundreds and hundreds of words. But if you look at the psycholinguistic people that say, when do certain words come in? Guess what? Words like big, red, color words, size words, other attributes, 50% of kids under 2 have acquired them, but in isolation. They don't have sentence structure, but they'll go red. They're not even going the whole sentence red, but you can hear there's a man function, or which color is this? Red. They don't say, I see the red ball when they're 2 years old. Like, what color is this? Red. Good enough. We're done. So they're acquiring attributes, but it's not in the sentence structure, because acquiring sentence structure is a different, linguistic feature than the simple acquisition of the attribute itself. So this too is just a misemphasis on a description of language development. And then the reason, I come back to why. Clearly, the person who wrote this knows that intonation is an autoclitic. There's just no way that would be a surprise. So that's where I start going, why are these myths and misconceptions running around and describing verbal behavior?
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/get-CEs. Are there other myths and misconceptions you'd like to share with the audience?
Just one more about the attributes. Every now and then, when I'm talking about a lot of theory with people, I say the nice thing is that kids don't come to our training, so they don't know our theories. So there are 2 publications out there. These are out there for a long time on what they call improvisation. So one of the criticisms of PECS has been that if you don't have a picture in a kid's book, then he can't request that thing. So the pictures are limiting vocabulary development, right? But what do kids do? Typically speaking, kids do when they go to a store and they look at a window and they see a cool toy. They have no idea what it's called. They kind of go, hey, I want that tall one, the one with the red head and he's holding a purple lance. Oh, it's a Power Ranger. Oh, I want a Power Ranger. He has no trouble describing what it is without, quote, knowing the name. So one of Nancy Neve's students did a study years ago showing that kids in using PECS, not speaking, but who had attributes, when you showed them something they didn't know the name of, they would improvise, which is described in the manual by Laurie. That is, they would use their courage. I want the square black cracker. And it was a chocolate-covered graham cracker, and the kid had no idea what it was called. But he described the shape, and he described the color, and he got as close as he could to a cookie by saying it was a cracker. And kids do that. And then there's another study out there showing that parents can teach that just as well as professionals can teach it. So my point is, these are kids who could do attributes because they didn't read that they're not allowed to do attributes with PECS.
And for those playing along at home, that's Markle et al. 2006 and looks like Chabane, I believe, 2009. Both of those papers are in Java, which, as BCB is, you can access through the board's website. But I'll have links to those particular papers as well. So I always appreciate how you anchor all of these things to the literature, Andy. Are there? So I wonder. So I've got some kind of just general questions here about PECS that maybe do or don't tie into myths and misconceptions. And I'm wondering if those are things that we can tackle now, or if there's another point you want to make relative to the myth aspect of our discussion thus far.
Let me just do one more, only because it was kind of the one that triggered my initial contact with you.
Excellent. Go right ahead then.
And again, for me, it's all about points. It's not about people and who said what. It's what is the point? What is being argued? So in that podcast that we were talking about earlier, someone was talking about, again, how do we differentiate matching the sample versus tacting with a picture? Okay. And the comment was that essentially the closer the sample stimulus is to the comparison stimulus, the more you'd make a case that it was matching the sample. As you reach a more arbitrary level between two, then you would lean more towards a tact. And when I heard this, my initial reaction was, so we're going to look at two different things, a picture and an object, and try to think how close they are to me, and that's going to get me to understand whether one is matching the sample or a tact? I thought behavior analysts analyze behavior under what condition? I thought it was the conditions that we're studying. Not, I think those two look alike. Oh, those two really don't look alike. So that's pretty scary to me, to suggest that somehow our rating, and that's what it is, a rating of similarity between two stimuli, judges which way to go. Again, that's what I call, related to this other logical thing we learn later on, is must versus may. I may use a pen to write. I must use a pen to write. You learned that when you were in grade school. Okay, birds may fly, birds must fly. We had lots of discussions about must versus may. And now we come to a picture must be matching the sample. And we don't realize, no, a picture may be matching the sample because the control of a picture may be different than matching the sample. And that's our field. That's what scares me the most. This is what we do. We're behavior analysts. And I know people get hung up on what's a behavior, but we're analyst is what we're all about. Behavior under what condition? That's what differentiates a man from a tact, from an introverbal, of the conditions. And the same is true about, can a picture be used and matching the sample? The answer is, of course. Must it be? Well, it's pretty scary to me if people think that that's logical. I can't hear you.
With regard to the logic piece, some of the, I guess, logical examples that you mentioned earlier, plus the must may, they do kind of remind me of a little bit of the various types of relational frames that have been described, by Hayes and colleagues and things like that in terms of, opposition, hierarchical, et cetera, et cetera. This is probably a whole different podcast, certainly. And, and I don't want to open a can of worms that we can't close here. But when I know, whether or not that's a interpretation of language and cognition that you agree with or not, I have to imagine that must have crossed your mind as you were putting this together, how some of these things perhaps line up with some of how these relational frames that have been described elsewhere.
Absolutely. And for me, part of the issue is whether you want to, if you will, buy into the very unique language and terminology and relational frame theory, or stick to stimulus equivalence and its evidence basis, you're still talking about the interrelationship between multiple stimuli and behaviors. And that's what we have to get to. You can go at it from different angles, but you can't deny the research on stimulus equivalence. So this is what, again, I've heard behavior analysts who almost, cringe at, you can't buy into Steve Hayes. That's, post-Skinnerians, dreadful. Well, why don't we just listen to all the ideas and see what practical things come out of it? And then whatever, there's been research by people, not connected to pyramid, if you will, showing these type of relationships do occur for picture use and speech and things like that. We're trying to get people to stop isolating lessons. This is my banding time. This is my receptive ID time. This is my imitation time. That's just a horrible way to teach kids. And then we blame them when, he didn't generalize. Never blame the learner for not doing something. Stick to, I didn't teach him to generalize. Take it on yourself for not knowing how to teach him, not the learner for not demonstrating it. So what we're trying to do is get people, if you've got you're playing with the ball, great. It's not ball playing time, but, maybe we're playing and I have a ball. Well, there are things to do with the ball. You can bounce the ball, kick the ball, roll the ball, spin the ball. You can ask for the ball. You can talk about the ball. You can describe the ball. And when I say talk, I mean any modality. You can listen to what other people are saying about it. Give me the ball, push the ball, dunk the ball, and you can imitate actions about it. So we're trying to get teachers, you have a ball in a lesson. We want all 4 possible lessons within your activity. Okay. You might emphasize one more than another. That's fine. Maybe you really do want to do more, requesting during this period of time. Fantastic. But stop the isolation. Get kids to realize this ball enters into many relationships. And the quicker you get to them, the less kids get, you call it stuck, resistance to change. However you want to describe it. It's doing a disservice to kid by isolating those things and then hoping sometime down the road we'll get back to it. That idea of we're going to teach the mastery and then generalize in 6 months. Generalization isn't waiting 6 months. So to me, that all relates to this issue of whether you see it as stimulus equivalence or other issues, things that the kids are interacting with and their behaviors are entering into multiple relations that we should take advantage of.
That makes perfect sense to me. All right. So I don't know how much time you have left, but I have a couple. We're starting to dig into some really practical stuff. We kind of went through some of the theoretical, analyses that nonetheless have practical applications, but we're kind of moving in towards more things that someone can listen to and be like, oh my gosh, I can implement that sooner rather than later. So if I can hold you for a little bit longer here, Andy, I've got some more, I suppose, less conceptual, more practical type of questions here. So as I said, I just came back from the really fun verbal behavior conference in Texas, and they were kind enough to ask me to moderate the panel, and it was great fun. And it involved basically trying to synthesize questions from the audience, and we ended up spending quite a bit of time. And this is not the one that you listened to. This one hasn't been released yet. We ended up spending quite a bit of time talking about AAC more generally and things like that. So this is just such a massive area of not just interest, but I would, perhaps also argue need, just based on the volume of questions that literally dominated the discussion. Everything. I mean, the speakers were fantastic. They talked about a range of really interesting topics. We ended up just almost exclusively talking about AAC, speech generation, sign, PECS, the whole 9 yards. It was a bit of a window into perhaps what the interests and needs are of the practitioner community who were in attendance. So, having said that, I'll maybe ask you some of the things that came up in our conversation here. But based on your experience, what are some? And I know we've covered this in previous shows too, but what are some ways in which you conceptualize figuring out what Pat McGreevy might call a method of speaking, if you will, for someone who's just coming into services? Say you have a very, very young child, language not developing as we would expect on a developmental track or trajectory, and nothing else has happened yet. So you've got essentially a brand new little one to try to make some meaningful differences with, and teach them some communication skills. So that, as I guess, blank of a canvas as you might be able to conceptualize here, how would you go about figuring out how to help this little one communicate out of all the various strategies that are available to us as clinicians?
Well, one of the key, in order to teach anybody, and I mean this, in order to teach anybody, I have to know what they're currently doing. If I do not understand what they're currently doing, under what conditions, I cannot teach. I have no idea what the next step is. I have no idea where to go. So one of the repertoires, which if I want to work on speech or sign language, all the research shows you need an imitative repertoire, whether you call it a coax or duplex, whatever you want to call it. Everybody knows what we're talking about. You don't have an imitative repertoire. And the research shows very young children with ASD, one of the characteristics of them versus anybody else is they don't have really good imitative repertoires. So if I need to teach that, of course I'm going to. I need to do that as quickly as I can. But for me, well, what's a kid going to do communication-wise if he doesn't have an imitative echoic repertoire? He still needs functional communication. So that's where, picture-based communication systems are important. And PECS versus a device. What is the attraction of a device? For most people, the attraction of the device is that it speaks. This clearly has to help a kid learn how to speak. Okay, so I'll ask everybody in your audience to go find the study showing that the voice on an SGG matters to the learner, not the listener. It's obvious the listener is hearing something. What's the learner doing? Okay, the simplest thing to do to figure out if the voice matters on an SGD is turn it off to see if it influences performance. Guess what? In over 40 years, there are only 2 studies that I could find that I search and I ask and I ask and I search and I'll ask the audience, send me a study if I don't know these 2. There are 2 studies which turned off the sound and had no impact on the learner, either in using the device or in developing speech. So here we are, 40 years down the road from vocals to SGDs. Everybody thrilled about the technology and the speech. No one has demonstrated the speech matters to the learner. I'm not saying it doesn't. What I'm saying is, why has nobody demonstrated in 40 years? That's pretty scary to me. Okay, so if I have a choice between, am I going to do PECS versus a device? Sorry, I'm doing PECS because I know the wealth of literature on PECS, the hundreds of studies on PECS, and its rapid acquisition. There were some people saying that when people are comparing, try to teach some PECS, try to teach an SGD, you're getting equivalent acquisition rates for some kids. Again, I don't deny that. But guess what? What we found years ago, 30 years ago, was the rate of picking up phase 1 was not predictive of developing robust speech. Phase 6 acquisition rates was. I had a kid who picked up phase 6 quickly. That kid was very, very likely to talk a lot, but not phase 1. So everybody jumping on, well, the kids are learning, SGD use just as quick. You're not asking the right question. It's not about the rate of learning what the equivalent of phase 1 is. The other issue is, and I'll ask this of the audience, for either use of SGD or sign language, show me the study with a large group of kids with ASD, very young, very limited speech in the beginning, who rapidly, within 6 months, learn a lot of spoken words, 80, 90, 100. One study. I don't know. And I look pretty hard. Either with an SGD or with sign language. There is a study with PECS by Schreiber and Stamer, who were comparing PRT to PECS. That was 2014, I think. You might find it quicker than it's on my screen.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Laura Schreiber she has this great talk in which she just says, we try to compare PECS and PRT because, we essentially wanted to blow PECS out of the water and show how much better, PRT was. And boom, the kids in the PECS, almost 20 kids, 2.5 years old, acquired 90 spoken words inside of 6 months. That is the most dramatic AAC impact out there. And no one talks about it.
That is Schreibman and Stamer, 2014, and that's in JAD. So just.
Yeah. And again, the reason people don't talk about it is because, if you will, because they have two groups, and it's a RCT, which was rare in our field, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no difference in the speech outcome for the PRT and the PECS condition. But look at the impact for the kids in the PECS condition. No other AAC study in any modality has ever shown that kind of impact in a short period of time. So that's kind of what I'm waiting for. I'm not saying, it won't happen, it's impossible. But think how long people have studied sign. Think how long people have used vocals and SGDs with this population. And there was no group study. Even when I talk to, if you will, well-known people in the field, I know a kid. I've worked with a kid. It's like, what? And this is just scary to me. We're going to revert back to my personal experience. I've used it with a lot of kids in my clinic, and it really works well. I don't know. I'm not as convinced by that.
I see. We could spend a whole lot of time talking about perhaps the rationale for larger and studies like that, but I'm trying to restrain myself because that's a whole nother rabbit hole we could go down.
Just think parakeets.
Oh man. What? Oh, I've also heard this. So it sounds like we're kind of maybe again going through some myths and misconceptions. Let me ask you this question. I've heard that the abandonment of AAC devices, kind of broadly speaking, the rate of such is relatively high. Yeah. Is that a myth or misconception? If it's not a myth, what are some tips for making these things, I guess, stickier, if you will, relative to the end user and those caregivers around them?
I think it's the functionality of the system relative to the learner, not the attraction of the system to the person giving the kid the device. Sorry, part of the discussion that I heard, was about core vocabulary, and we deal with that all the time. People with an SGD want to, put core words, lots of words, 80 pictures, 100 pictures on the front of them, and then he has a robust vocabulary. Well, the equivalent is, I got a kid, typically developing kid. He's 5 years old. I'm teaching him how to read. He's up to about 50 words. So you know what I'm doing now? He carries around a dictionary, because now he has a robust reading repertoire available to him. I mean, you would just laugh at me. I said, I'm making this 5-year-old walk around with a dictionary because it's got all the words. Who cares? He's making contact with 50 of them. So who cares that a device has, 50 words, 100 words, 1,000 words? Doesn't matter if the kid is making contact with a few. And the way kids acquire the initial vocabulary is by things they're personally interested in. Yes, speaking those call them fringe. And they're fringe because you grew up in a house where there were baseball bats. I didn't have any baseball bats in my house. So guess what? You learned baseball and I didn't. Well, quote, it's fringe. Yeah, but it's the way language is learned. And now there are several publications by speech pathologists pointing out core boards are not helping these kids acquire the vocabulary they should. So I think there's some abandonment when kids don't find it functional. It's more like, I know you want me to carry this around, but it's not as useful to me as you think it is. So that's the issue. Are there kids who have had textbooks that, find it, onerous to use the textbook and take the book around with them? Sure. It's like, like you wear glasses, I think.
Oh, yeah.
So when you were a kid, did you always have your glasses with you? Did you have to learn them? The heck with vanity and the effort of this and that. I need the glasses. And you figured out where to put them, so you ran into the glasses. And we all had to do that. And so that's what we try to convince kids. We don't make them carry their communication book around with them. What we do is create communication opportunities where you don't have your book. You're losing time. You're losing opportunities. And it's the normal. This is good for you. This is not me making you do it.
Yeah, life gets better when you can communicate. And in order to communicate, you need to have your tools.
Yeah, and if you only set up the communication, whether it's a device or PECS at snack time and lunchtime, that's what I call the edible exchange communication system. It's just like limited utility. When parents realize every single room has a communication opportunity, boom, that's when you're going to get kids using both devices or PECS book. It's about the utility.
Got it. That's very helpful. I appreciate you, again, digressing on that. We're almost out of time here, but I can't let you go without asking about prompts. I know we went deep on prompts in a previous episode, but just real quick, because I know we get new listeners all the time, and they may or may not have the time to kind of go back and check out the back catalog here. So, real quick, what do you what are some common mistakes with prompts, and what are some ways practitioners can, I guess, be more observant of perhaps more effective prompt strategies?
All right. So all behavior analysts think about our roots. Our roots in applied behavior analysis is an experimental behavior analysis. That's where a lot of the terminology is defined. So reinforcers are defined from laboratory experiences. Okay. And we know that reinforcer is defined contingently. A reinforcer is defined in its relationship to a behavior. You cannot split them apart. Okay. So the only way to define a reinforcer is by its impact on behavior. We're uncomfortable with that. We don't grow up that way of thinking about things in contingent relationships, right? Then you have this word prompt. What's the problem? It didn't derive from the laboratory. You don't prompt the pigeon. Okay.
Right.
Just, have fun in your own head about how you would prompt a pigeon, and you realize how silly it is. Skinner developed shaping, never touched the pigeon. He didn't talk to the pigeon. Nothing happened except reinforcement contingencies changed. So in applied fields, what I'm trying to get everybody to understand is a prompt is something we do to help performance, help the target performance. And it must be defined contingently. It is a prompt if it helps in performance. Okay? We know that about reinforcement. What we have to do is realize about the other side of behavior, the antecedent behavior contingent relationship. Okay? So the thing you did was a prompt only if it helped performance. You cannot say, I prompted, but it didn't work. That's like saying I reinforced, but the behavior didn't change. You can't say that. You can't say, well, same thing. You gestured, but it wasn't a prompt. Great. Now, the key is the word help. Help in performance. My background is from, Israel Gold Diamond. We are constructionists. We build repertoires. We're not focused on a reductionist model of getting rid of behaviors. But think what's happened in our field. There are people who are concerned about non-compliance, which totally drives me crazy because the moment you put the beard down, you realize non-compliance is not a behavior. We're talking about not behaviors. Why are we doing that? And so then we say, I prompted him to comply. What? The only reason, quote, you prompted him to comply is because you're concerned about non-compliance. So you're in this mess from the beginning. Using prompt to restrain, restrict, confine movement is not a prompt. The thing you do to make a kid do something was not helpful. So you have people say, well, the kid, he's supposed to wash his hands and he didn't, so I stood up behind him and I prompted him to wash his hands. No, you didn't. You physically restrained the kid, but do not call that a prompt. And that's why we're being slammed in our field. Because there are people watching people do restraint procedures, confinement, restriction, and they're saying they're prompting. Well, of course they should be protesting. But then when the rest of us are actually being helpful, we're getting slammed because we're getting knocked for we're not really helpful. Now we're making the kid do it. No. Just walk around society and see how many times people are helping kids learn to do things by physical assistance. It abounds in our culture. It's not just behavior analysts who do it, but we're getting slammed for doing that because of the misapplication of those kinds of contact when help is not the issue.
I see. All right. That's a really great point to end on. Andy, thanks again. This hour just literally flew right by. I'm so glad you reached out for another conversation, and let's not wait 2 or 3 years to do it again. Let's do this again soon. I enjoyed it.
Sounds good, Matt. Thank you for the opportunity.
Anytime.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.